Hello there. Tonight we are going to walk through the streets of ancient Rome, barefoot, half dreaming, with a warm breeze trailing behind us and the scent of crushed violets on stone. The city glows under the moonlight like a sleeping beast belly warm from the day's heat, still breathing in its sleep. And just there ahead of you, among the whispers and sandal slaps of patricians and peasants alike, walks the most powerful man in the world, hand in hand with a woman wrapped in silks and mystery. Her hair gleams like polished amber. Her skin, powdered, perfumed, is lit with oil lamp glow. But something's off. You can't quite say what. And then the whispers begin. What if I told you that wasn't a woman? What if I told you her name used to be Sporus? What if I told you you probably wouldn't survive a single week in Nero's Rome? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I always love knowing who else is awake with me tonight. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. The year is 67 AD. And yes, that's Nero walking through the Roman Forum. No guards flank him, at least not obviously. The danger isn't from others. It never is when you believe you're a god. The man beside him, the woman beside him, wears jewels heavy enough to dislocate the neck silks, threaded with gold eyes rimmed in charcoal coal. Her sandals are stitched with pearls. But everyone is watching her for a different reason. Because they know, because they remember. Her name is Sabina, they say, but it's a name borrowed, stolen, reattached, like a golden mask, to a face too young and too delicate to carry this weight. You can hear it in the hush between footsteps. That's him. That's the boy. And still people bow. They bow anyway, because in Nero's Rome the truth is optional. But obedience, that's not. The air smells like metal and lilies. Somewhere behind the columns, incense burns thick and heavy. The public walks past, pretending. They pretend so hard it starts to feel real, that this is just a new empress. Another one of Nero's whims. A beautiful consort. A woman, entirely and unquestionably female. But this is Sporus. And Sporus was not born Sabina. Sporus was born a boy, probably in the palace itself, or at least close enough to feel the tremors of power from his cradle. He was a freedman child, technically no longer a slave, but not exactly free either. He had a sharp mind and, unfortunately, a beautiful face. The kind of beauty that got you noticed for all the wrong reasons. The kind of beauty that didn't protect you. It made you available. Historians still debate whether Nero chose Sporus out of love grief or just theatrical madness. Maybe all three, or maybe none. What we do know is this Poppaea Sabina, Nero's beloved wife, had died under tragic and violent circumstances, and the emperor never truly let her go. So when he saw Sporus, that face, that elegance in the cheekbones, that eerie resemblance to the wife he'd broken with his own hands, something in him twisted. You know the feeling when a song reminds you of someone you lost, and for a second, your heart lurches. Imagine that, but with absolute power. Imagine grief, obsession, and the full might of an empire at your disposal. That's what this was. Sporus, for his part, didn't have a choice. He didn't walk into this like a seducer or an opportunist. He was a child. 14, maybe 15. Still soft around the edges. Raised in marble corridors and schooled in administration, he probably dreamed of accounting ledgers and scrolls, not wedding veils and bridal processions, but there was no refusal. Not in Nero's world. By the time they walked through that forum, like you're seeing them now, it had already happened. The surgeries, the silks, the voice lessons, the erasure. It's strange to think how little agency Sporus had, how even the shape of his body was rewritten like a bad script. And still he walked. He smiled. He said the right things at the right time. They trained him to respond to the name Sabina like it had always been his. Like he had asked for this. He hadn't. The Roman elite played along, of course. They always did. They toasted the marriage-gifted golden bracelets nodded solemnly at banquets, as Nero reminisced about memories that Sporus was too young and too not dead to have shared. "Oh, remember that afternoon by the fountains," Nero might say, sipping pomegranate wine, eyes moist with performance. "You wore your emerald gown." And Sporus, knowing the consequences of misstepping even a single word, would reply, "Yes, I remember." The emerald gown had belonged to Poppaea, so had the jewelry, so had the name, and now it all belonged to him. Do you ever think about what it feels like to sleep in someone else's bed? Someone who died in it, to wear their clothes, sit in their chair, eat from their dishes while everyone pretends you are them. That was daily life for Sporus. People sometimes imagine ancient Rome as this orgiastic place of freedom and hedonism. But let's be honest, it was terrifyingly rigid. You were either above the system or crushed by it. And Sporus, he was caught in the gears, a golden bird in a gilded cage. Odd fact, the Roman elite used powdered mouse brains as teeth whitener. They valued appearances no matter how grotesque the cost. And in that same spirit, Nero valued illusion above all. Sporus wasn't allowed to just look like Poppaea. He had to become her. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, literally, publicly, legally, and so he did. The first time the public saw them hand in hand, they bowed. Not just because they feared Nero, though they did, but because they couldn't risk seeing what was really happening, a boy castrated, renamed, redressed, reintroduced to the world as someone else's ghost. You know the worst part? He was good at it. Sporus became so skilled at the role that some courtiers forgot he hadn't always been Sabina. His steps were fluid, his gestures dainty. His gaze held that soft, imperial distance expected of an empress. And Nero was delighted, because in his mind, the past wasn't lost. It had been rewritten. The power of belief when paired with absolute authority is a terrifying thing. Nero didn't just mourn Poppaea. He reinstalled her. You're probably wondering why no one stopped him. But who exactly was going to the senators? They'd long since lost their backbone. The generals, too far, too distracted, too bribed. The people, they clapped when he sang and trembled when he shouted. They whispered. They always whispered. But no one intervened. Because sometimes the scariest tyrant is the one who truly believes his own illusions. And so Sporus walked beside him, not as himself, but as a walking, breathing lie wrapped in pearls. And tonight we're going to follow him, all the way to the altar, to the palace, to the edge of an empire in flames. But let's not rush. You've got time. We've got 9 more stories to whisper through. The air in the palace smelled like lilies and animal fat. Not because anyone liked that smell, but because the Romans, for all their advancements, still hadn't quite figured out the delicate balance between opulence and overkill. Every room, every corridor, every statue of a half-naked god glistened with gold leaf sweat and fear. And it was here among the velvet cushions and suspicion that Nero fell in love. Or more accurately, Nero became consumed. Her name was Poppaea Sabina. Just saying it felt like a spell, sharp consonants followed by silk. She wasn't his wife at first, not even his mistress. She was someone else's problem, a minor flame in the imperial court, married to a general trailing perfumes through hallways like bait. But Nero saw her once, maybe twice, and that was it. Everything changed. Historians still debate whether Poppaea truly loved Nero or merely saw him as a vehicle for her ambition. What's more likely, she had eyes like polished agate and a brain like a steel trap. Women in the Roman elite weren't given power, so they learned to take it by proximity. Poppaea didn't flirt. She curated desire. Nero was already married to Octavia, then daughter of the previous emperor Claudius. Politically ideal, personally forgettable. Octavia was everything Rome respected and nothing Nero wanted. Reserved, proper, dutiful. She dressed in linen instead of silk, never wore scented oils, and reportedly didn't care for music or theater, two of Nero's favorite tools for self-worship. Basically, she was a ghost, haunting the palace halls. So when Poppaea appeared dripping in imported fabrics, laughing too loudly at Nero's off-key lyre performances, it was like a gust of heat through dry wood. She didn't tiptoe. She strolled in with the poise of someone who knew exactly how to make a man destroy himself for her. She praised Nero's poetry, told him he had the voice of Apollo, suggested that Octavia was too dull to match his divine gifts. It didn't take long. Nero began making changes, first subtle ones. Shifting where Poppaea sat at dinner, sending her bracelets, inviting her on private consultations, then bigger ones. He stopped spending nights with Octavia. He began whispering about how the empress was infertile, how the gods must be punishing him by giving him a barren womb. Eventually, he divorced her, publicly, cruelly. Octavia didn't cry. She was Roman nobility to her bone marrow. But the people did. They loved Octavia. She was the daughter of an emperor, a symbol of continuity. Poppaea, she was everything they feared in a new Rome, decadent, foreign, manipulative. The public protested. So Nero had Octavia banished. When that didn't quiet the unrest, he had her killed. They said she died in a hot steam bath, that her last words were a prayer. But no one knows for sure. Nero made sure there were no witnesses left to ask. And then Poppaea was empress. The marriage was a spectacle. Gold-embroidered everything. Imported elephants. Musicians flown in from the edges of the empire. It was said Nero ordered the moon to be mirrored in a reflecting pool, just so it would shine perfectly on Poppaea's face during their vows. Poets wrote sonnets on the spot. Bread was given to the poor. Wine flowed like water. It was theater, and Poppaea played her part beautifully. She didn't just sit beside Nero, she co-ruled. Whispered in his ear during Senate meetings. Suggested which governors should be recalled. Advised on military campaigns. She even had input on the empire's religious policies. Historians note that under her influence, Nero began to emphasize Eastern cults, divine emperorship, and elaborate court rituals, all more symbolic, more dramatic, more about him. She gave him confidence and permission. To be the performer he always wanted to be. He began taking the stage in public singing, acting, dancing, something no emperor had dared do. The aristocracy squirmed, but Poppaea clapped the loudest, and Nero, he mistook that applause for love. It's possible she did love him at least for a while. Maybe she loved the power. Maybe she loved the man. Maybe both. But it was dangerous either way, because Nero wasn't built for love. He was built for need, and need turns toxic when no one says no. He followed her like a shadow. Commissioned 1,000 likenesses, busts, mosaics, paintings, even perfume blends inspired by the way her hair smelled in the sun. He reportedly watched her sleep for hours, built fountains in her honor, had musicians write songs in her name. If she left a room, he followed. If someone looked at her too long, they disappeared. He didn't love her like a person. He loved her like an idea, something beautiful and immortal, something that should never leave, never age, never contradict him. But Poppaea was not an idea. She was a woman, and women get tired. Somewhere along the way, the cracks began to show. The arguments became more frequent. She'd call out his extravagance, criticize his poetry, question his spending. She didn't laugh at the jokes anymore. He started to resent that. She was pregnant again, her second child. The first had died. This one was supposed to be different. A son, an heir, a reason to keep going, and then it happened. Historians still debate how it began. Some say she insulted one of his performances. Others say she simply disagreed with him. Others claim it was nothing, just a regular domestic argument that spiraled. But it ended with a scream. Some say he kicked her. Others say he struck her across the stomach. Whatever the exact moment looked like, the result was the same. A pregnant empress, bleeding, dying, crumpled on marble. And Nero sobbing, begging, demanding doctors raise her from the dead. She didn't make it. Neither did the baby. And in that moment, Rome changed. The man who ruled 60 million people couldn't save the one person he believed he truly loved. He'd destroyed her, and worse, he knew it. What followed wasn't healing. It wasn't even grief. It was performance. He refused to burn her body. Roman tradition be damned. Instead, he embalmed it, encased it in alabaster, and built a tomb more lavish than his own mother's. He declared her divine, had priests chant her name, required court officials to speak of her in the present tense, as if she might enter the room any moment. He dined with her corpse, talked to it, smiled at it, said things like, "You always loved these olives," and then placed one by her lips. No one stopped him, because you don't tell a god to grieve properly. So the empire watched as Nero unraveled one banquet at a time, whispering to a woman who was no longer there. And somewhere in the palace, in the shadow of it all, Sporus polished silver platters and counted steps along the marble floor, still just a boy. But not for long. The light in the palace was always soft at night, filtered through layers of silk and incense. But it couldn't hide everything. Not the silence. Not the slow unraveling of something that had once looked like power. And not the sound of footsteps measured, deliberate, echoing behind a man who had lost the only person he believed had ever belonged to him. Nero had stopped pretending to function like an emperor. He no longer led councils, rarely read reports, delegated all governance to those too terrified to object. Instead, he drifted through rooms like a ghost in his own empire. His hair unkempt, his robes wrinkled, and his hands always fidgeting with something lace thread the corner of a veil. It was during this period that he saw Sporus. Not for the first time, Sporus had been around. He was a palace boy, maybe 16 by now, raised among marble walls and echoes. But that day, something in Nero's broken mind clicked. He stopped mid-stride. The boy had turned slightly, just enough for the light from a nearby oil lamp to touch his face, the cheekbones, the mouth, the tilt of the head. It wasn't a perfect match, but it was close. Close enough for a man who hadn't slept properly in weeks. Close enough for a man desperate to believe in ghosts. And Nero, perhaps for a moment, truly believed. Historians still debate whether this was the moment his madness fully consumed him, or whether it was calculated, an attempt to fill a void so massive it bent reality itself. But whatever the reason, what followed was not a romance. It was a project. It began with small things. A new assignment for Sporus, less kitchen work, more time in the inner palace, a change in his garments, perfumed oils in his bath. Tutors brought in under false pretenses, music teachers, etiquette coaches, a former actress who now made a living teaching noblewomen how to walk with dignity. Then the physicians arrived. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. This was not grooming. This was reshaping. Nero summoned Rome's best medical minds, not to cure an illness, but to make a boy into something else. Something he could marry. Something he could present. Something he could believe in. The order castration, the method brutal. Ancient Roman surgical practices were unsophisticated, to put it gently. There was no real anesthesia, no antibiotics, no guarantee of survival. The procedure was as painful as it was life-altering, and once complete, there was no going back. Sporus did not consent. He didn't refuse either, because refusal was a privilege for people with rights. He screamed, of course. Probably. It would have been impossible not to. But the walls of the palace were thick, and the guards outside were well paid. And Nero had already decided. Afterward, the recovery took weeks, maybe months. No one recorded that part in detail. It wasn't glamorous. Just blood and bandages and quiet whimpering in a room filled with lavender to cover the smell. When Sporus was able to stand again, the next phase began. He was renamed Sabina after the dead empress. The name was spoken like a blessing, or a sentence. The voice coaches returned. So did the tailors. And this time there were no more disguises. The clothing was explicitly feminine, cut to flatter the new body, to soften the hips, to highlight features that Sporus never asked to emphasize. Jewelers carved cameos of Poppaea, then altered them to resemble Sporus's face. Hairdressers arrived with heated metal rods and ornate pins, curling and styling the boy's hair until he resembled a portrait that wasn't his. They trained him to pour wine like a lady, to tilt his head at compliments, to hold his fan not for cooling, but for message. Do you know how many messages a Roman woman could send with a fan? Acceptance, rejection, flirtation, defiance, all in a flick of the wrist. Sporus learned them all, because to survive he had to. He even learned how to cry gently without smudging his makeup. Because that was expected too. Outside, the city whispered. Inside, Sporus vanished. Odd fact. Roman aristocrats believed rubbing crushed pearls on your skin would make you glow like a goddess. They didn't realize it also slowly poisoned you. But glowing was more important than living, apparently. And Sporus was meant to glow. He was rarely alone. Servants hovered around him. Not friends, never friends. They were watchers, artists, dressers, instructors. He was the center of a performance he never auditioned for, one that consumed every moment of every day. The mirrors in his quarters were polished to gleaming. Each one showed him a version of himself he no longer recognized. His voice was higher now, part training, part trauma. His skin was waxed, his eyes outlined in kohl, and behind them a vacancy had started to bloom. But he was learning how to walk like a memory, how to sit like a statue, how to breathe like someone else. Nero, for his part, was thrilled. He would enter Sabina's rooms and gasp as if seeing Poppaea for the first time again. Oh, he'd say, fingers trembling at the sight. You wore that necklace in Alexandria, remember? And Sporus would nod. Of course. He'd never been to Alexandria, but saying that would be dangerous. Because Nero didn't want a boy who resembled his wife. He wanted his wife. Exactly. Perfectly. Unquestionably. And Sporus, God's help him, was becoming her. The court didn't know what to do. Some tried to play along, congratulating Sabina on her beauty, her grace, her radiance. Others looked away. A few senators muttered to themselves in corners, but none dared to say anything aloud. Because what do you say to a man who claims to have resurrected the dead? You bow, you smile, you say she looks more radiant than ever. Historians still debate what Sporus was thinking during these weeks of transformation. Some believe he dissociated entirely, becoming a passive shell. Others argue he developed a quiet cunning, memorizing Nero's moods, perfecting responses, surviving not by surrender, but by outplaying. The truth is probably both, because people can fracture and adapt at the same time. And Sporus, he was now a fractured adaptation. He still had nightmares, probably. But the servants were trained not to speak of them, just clean the bed sheets and refill the lavender. And when Nero came to him at night, whispering, "My Sabina, you've returned," there was no answer expected, but a soft smile and an even softer kiss on the emperor's knuckles. So Sporus kissed and smiled and kept living, one step at a time, toward a wedding, toward a crown he never asked for, toward a stage with no script and no escape. There is a stillness that settles in a palace before a wedding, even when that wedding is drenched in madness. The marble halls were swept 3 times a day. Musicians practiced endlessly behind thick curtains, their fingers cramping from repetition. Seamstresses whispered over bolts of imported fabric, cutting gowns that shimmered with sapphires and betrayal. The kitchen smelled of honeyed lamb and roasted figs. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, were flowers, thousands of them. Lush garlands of roses, violets, crocuses, drenched in perfume, ordered by the emperor himself. The scent was suffocating. Rome was preparing to marry a boy to a god. They didn't call it that, of course. No one would dare. Officially, it was a union between Nero and Sabina, his radiant bride, reborn beloved, and conveniently very quiet about her own origins. The invitations written in gold ink on dyed vellum described it as a celebration of renewal, a return of joy, the reawakening of divine favor. But everyone knew. They remembered the real Sabina, the one with the sharp wit and the sharper tongue, the one who had died with her unborn child inside her, the one who used to walk the palace corridors like a queen before she ever wore a crown. Now, this was a ghost play, a pantomime with real blood in the seams. The wedding was scheduled for spring, specifically timed, to coincide with a religious festival, giving it extra ceremonial weight. It would take place in the largest hall of the Domus Aurea, Nero's own golden palace, a monstrosity of wealth and delusion where ceilings were embedded with pearls and secret mechanisms could rain down rose petals at the press of a button. And at the center of it all would stand Sporus, now fully styled as Empress Sabina. He was dressed for weeks before the event, fitted and refitted, stitched into gowns so heavy with embroidery he had to be held up at the shoulders by 2 attendants. His skin was powdered until it lost all color. His lips were tinted coral, and his eyes, oh, his eyes were lined so precisely they looked sculpted. A mirror of Poppeia's last official portrait. Jewels that had once belonged to the dead empress were refashioned to fit him. Necklaces shortened, bracelets altered. A circlet of emeralds was placed on his head, just slightly crooked, because the court jeweler had been trembling too hard to secure it straight. They said Sporus didn't speak much in those days, but when he did, it was always softly, measured, perfect, because this wasn't just a wedding, it was a resurrection. Nero, of course, was in his element. He rehearsed the vows like an actor, practiced how he'd lift the veil, how he'd gaze into Sporus's eyes, how long the kiss should last. He even wrote an original song to perform at the reception, a tragic ballad in minor key where he compared love to a rose growing from ash. Odd fact, Nero had performed in over 1,000 competitions across Greece during his artistic tours. He won every single one, because of course no judge dared let him lose. This wedding would be no different. Winning was mandatory. The day of the ceremony arrived like a storm wearing pearls. The palace glowed. Torches were lit hours before sunset. The scent of incense was so thick it clung to your tongue. Guests arrived in togas spun with gold thread. Senators, generals, foreign dignitaries who had no idea what they were walking into. They were greeted at the doors with cups of wine and an order to smile. Inside, the grand hall had been transformed. The floor was mosaicked with scenes from Venus's birth. The walls were draped in imperial purple, the most expensive dye known in the world. And at the altar stood Sporus, still only a teenager, dressed in a bridal gown that shimmered like molten moonlight. He didn't cry. He didn't tremble. He just stood, and then Nero entered. The emperor wore a white tunic with a red stripe, the traditional mark of power. His hair had been curled, his cheeks flushed with pigment. He looked more like a myth than a man. The music started. The vows were spoken. Hands were joined. Bread was broken. Wine was shared. A scroll was signed. And just like that, the union was official. The crowd erupted in polite applause. Some wept, though not necessarily out of joy. Others clapped with grim determination, knowing their survival depended on enthusiasm. And then came the kiss. Nero lifted the veil with trembling hands. He stared into Sporus's eyes. For a moment, he didn't blink. "You're here," he whispered. "You came back to me." And Sporus Sabina nodded, because that was what he was supposed to do. Later at the banquet, he was seated at Nero's right hand, fed grapes from golden dishes, toasted by generals, serenaded by poets, laughed at jokes he didn't understand. Every smile was rehearsed, every gesture monitored, every breath belonged to someone else. Historians still debate how much of this was pure delusion and how much was theater. Did Nero truly believe Sabina had returned, or did he simply choose to believe because belief was more convenient than grief? Or maybe, and here's the darkest thought of all, he knew exactly what he was doing. And he enjoyed it, because this wasn't about love. It was about control, about making the world bend to his fantasy, about proving that even death couldn't take something from him without permission. After the final toast, Nero stood and sang his song. The audience wept on cue, and Sporus sat there, hands folded in silk, wearing a ring that had once belonged to a dead woman, knowing that no matter how perfectly he played the role, he would never be real, only remembered as an echo, as a replacement, as a doll. The newlyweds disappeared into the inner palace that night. What happened behind those doors is lost to history. But the next morning Sporus reappeared, hair curled, lips painted, and smiling, just like a good wife should. Morning in the Domus Aurea arrived not with sunrise but with the gentle scrape of servants drawing back silk curtains embroidered with phoenixes. Light filtered through layers of fabric and fell in gold puddles on polished stone. Somewhere water trickled from a fountain carved to resemble Venus rising from sea foam. It was all so beautiful and so artificial. This was Sporus's new home, or rather Sabina's. He no longer had chambers of his own. Not really. The room he slept in had once belonged to the real Poppaea Sabina. Her brushes were still there, arranged neatly on the dressing table. Her perfume bottles, her favorite mirror, even her slippers. Nero had preserved it all like a museum or a shrine. Sporus was simply the new exhibit. The room had no sharp edges. It had been redesigned for softness: pillows, curtains, gentle curves in the furniture. But beneath that comfort was control. Every object reminded him of who he was supposed to be and who he was no longer allowed to be. He woke each day to the sound of rustling fabric, servants entering in silence, drawing baths scented with rose and verbena, dressing him in robes selected by imperial hand. Each morning, a eunuch would ask with perfect courtesy, "Which earrings today, Domina?" The ones with emeralds Sabina had once favored. And so Sporus chose those. There was no mirror he could turn away from. They were everywhere, on walls, on tables, even embedded into pillars. His reflection followed him like a second skin. He'd catch glimpses of himself mid-step and pause, confused. The soft face, the dark lashes, the curl of the hair pinned back with rubies. He looked nothing like the boy he remembered. If he remembered him at all, the palace had trained him well. His voice stayed high and soft like summer wind. His walk had become smooth, careful. His laughter, because laughter was expected, had a bell-like quality, charming and effortless. Except it wasn't. Nothing was effortless. Every gesture had been taught, every word rehearsed. He had tutors now, not in philosophy or math, but in posture and poise. A proper empress doesn't run, one had said. She glides. He practiced for hours. How to hold a goblet, how to incline his head, how to signal displeasure with a mere flick of his wrist. There were language coaches too. They worked on feminine phrasing, tonal shifts, phrases that emphasized delicacy rather than strength. One even brought scrolls of Poppaea's private letters, so Sporus could mimic her writing style. Odd fact: Poppaea once wrote a letter to a provincial governor where she scolded him for failing to build a temple in her honor fast enough. It ended with a kiss mark in scented wax. Sporus had to learn how to do that too. And yet no matter how perfect the performance, it was never enough to make it feel real. At meals, Nero would hold his hand, not for affection, but for theater. He would reminisce aloud. "Do you remember that summer we spent in Antium by the sea?" Sporus would nod, smile. Yes, of course. He had never been to Antium. But Nero liked it when she remembered things. So Sporus remembered. Historians still debate whether Nero actually believed in the transformation, or whether he simply willed the delusion to live beside him. Either way, Sporus was locked in a role he could never step out of, not even in sleep. He ate when Nero ate. He wept when Nero wept. He praised Nero's poetry even when it made no sense, especially when it made no sense. And at night, when the palace grew quiet and the last musicians had gone, Nero would enter Sabina's bedchamber with steps that dragged. He always came alone, save for a servant who carried a lyre or a cup of wine. Sporus never knew which Nero he'd get. Sometimes he would lie down beside him and weep. Talk about dreams in which Sabina forgave him. Whisper to the ceiling that he missed her voice even though it was right there echoing back in a body not her own. Other nights he would sing. Love songs mostly. Sometimes softly. Sometimes with an almost childlike glee. Then he'd stroke Sporus's face and call him beautiful. Not Sporus. Not Sabina even. Just you. You're here, he'd murmur. You never really left me. And Sporus would whisper back, I'm here, because it was safer than silence. In public, Nero made sure everyone acknowledged Sporus as empress. He was given his own retinue, a litter for parades guards for appearances, and a small staff of advisors. But none of it was real power. It was spectacle. Set dressing. A beautiful bird in a golden cage. There was even a statue, commissioned marble, life-sized with soft curves and flowing robes. The sculptor had worked from memory and portraits of the original Sabina. But the face was Sporus. They unveiled it during a banquet. Guests clapped politely. Nero clapped longest. Sporus did not clap. He just stared. He knew that face too well. It wasn't his. He often wondered what would happen if he said the wrong thing, laughed at the wrong moment, refused to smile, refused to respond when Nero called him by a name that didn't belong to him. But he never found out, because he never tried. He had seen what Nero did to those who disappointed him, and he wasn't ready to die. Not yet. Some nights he would sit by the window, staring out into the torchlit gardens, wondering if he was still inside his own body. If the real Sporus had withered like a root beneath the soil, waiting for someone to dig him up. Or if he had simply disappeared. Maybe that was the worst part. Not the jewels, not the silence, but the fear that there might be nothing left under the silks and paint. That the performance had swallowed the person whole. He thought about running. Briefly. But where the world outside Rome didn't exist for people like him. He wasn't a person anymore. He was a memory. And memories don't run. They fade. Quietly. Softly. Until all that's left is perfume on a pillow. It began with a pair of scissors. Not the household kind. These were surgical slender, gleaming with delicate handles forged by a smith who likely never knew what they would be used for. They sat quietly on a silver tray alongside a curved blade, clean linens, and a bowl of warm water that rippled slightly with every footstep in the room. This was not a hospital. It was a palace. The operation was not to save a life. It was to erase one. They didn't call it castration, of course. That word would have been far too harsh for Nero's fantasy. The court physicians used euphemisms, terms like refinement or divine shaping. But no soft word could change the truth. Sporus was about to be cut into a shape that better suited a dead man's dream. He was told to lie down on a cushioned table. The room smelled of honey and laurel, strong enough to mask the sharp tang of fear. There were no straps. He didn't need them. The guards stood by with spears, and besides, where would he run? He lay very still. One of the physicians, a man with trembling hands and dark bruises under his eyes, dabbed Sporus's forehead with a cloth. "Be still, Sabina," he whispered. "Not Sporus. Sabina, always Sabina now." They gave him poppy juice for the pain. Crude anesthesia at best. Enough to blur the edges, not erase them. When the blade touched him, Sporus screamed, and then somewhere between the second cut and the cauterization, he stopped making sound altogether. Historians still debate whether Nero watched. Some say he stood outside the chamber pacing. Others claim he stayed in the room whispering lullabies. What's certain is this: he approved it. He ordered it, and when it was over, he sent flowers. The recovery was slow, painful, private. The palace, always so loud with flutes and footsteps, seemed to mute itself around him. Curtains were drawn. Visitors were turned away. Only the most trusted servants entered, and even they did not speak unless spoken to. Sporus no Sabina lay in silken sheets, fevered and trembling, while Roman sunlight carved cruel shapes across the marble floor. Odd fact: Romans believed that the body could be balanced through humor's 4 liquids that controlled health and temperament. Blood phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. After the operation, it was said Sabina's humors were in perfect balance. But of course no one asked how he felt, only whether the swelling had gone down, whether the stitches had held, whether the emperor would be pleased. And when he could stand again, dizzy, thin, and silent, the training resumed. He was given a new wardrobe, gowns stitched with golden thread, tunics so light they floated when he walked, sandals encrusted with mother-of-pearl, necklaces strung from Poppeia's old jewelry resized for a smaller throat, and veils, always veils. He was taught how to wear them with grace, how to lift them when eating, how to lower them in mourning, how to let them fall just so across his shoulder in moments of imperial charm. Every detail mattered. He was the emperor's wife now, not just in theory, not just in appearances, but in flesh. And yet he didn't quite exist. He had no family, no title of his own, no lineage to trace. He was not recorded in senatorial logs, not written into any law. His name Sporus was erased in most court documents. Only Sabina remained. At official functions, he sat beside Nero on a raised platform, silent and glowing. When foreign ambassadors visited, they bowed to him. Some looked confused. Others looked too long. Those who looked too long were quietly escorted away. Nero's possessiveness had not softened. If anything, it had grown sharper, more volatile. He expected Sabina to read his thoughts, anticipate his moods, laugh at his jokes before the punchline. And he often grew agitated when Sporus Sabina paused too long before answering. "You used to be so quick," Nero would say, his voice cool and cutting, and Sporus would nod. "I'm sorry," he'd whisper, "I'll be better. Better at being someone else." He never left the palace grounds alone, never walked in public without a dozen eyes on him. His staff monitored his movements, his meals, his visitors. Even his dreams were not his own. He was told to keep a dream journal for imperial interpretation. He never wrote in it. There was nothing left to say. Sometimes at night, he'd sneak to the edge of the garden, the part no one guarded, because no one thought he'd go there. He would sit on a stone bench and stare at the stars, and he would imagine, what if he had said no? What if he had screamed louder, fought harder, run faster? But it didn't matter now. The scissors had done their work. The silence had taken root. And the ceremony was complete. Historians still debate whether the marriage was ever consummated. Some say Nero respected the boundaries he himself created. Others suggest he crossed every line imaginable. There are no records, only speculation. And silence, always silence. In the weeks that followed the surgery, Nero became more affectionate, publicly at least. He gave Sabina Sporus new titles, tokens, a pet peacock, a golden hairbrush, a marble sculpture carved in his likeness depicting him as Venus rising from the sea. He unveiled it during a banquet. People clapped. Sporus did not. He just bowed his head, because that too had been practiced. Everything was practiced now. He had no room for spontaneity, no permission for sincerity. Even his tears had to be the right size, the right temperature. Not too hysterical, not too cold, not too real. He was told once to smile more, because Sabina had smiled often, and so he did. He smiled until his cheeks ached, until he forgot what his face looked like when it didn't, until the mask fit too well to remove. And yet, deep inside behind the powder and perfume, something stirred, something tiny, fractured, still breathing, not hope, not resistance, just memory, faint and flickering, like a candle in a locked room, waiting, watching, not quite extinguished, not yet. The imperial wedding had been months ago, but in Nero's Rome time didn't flow so much as swirl, perfumed, smoky, disoriented. And within this scented haze of luxury and performance life, as Sabina was not lived, but performed, Nero, always hungry for new ways to provoke awe and confusion, had decided to make their union something the world could not ignore. Rome had seen emperors marry, but not like this. Not with her. Not with a boy in pearls, castrated and costumed, adored and imprisoned in equal measure. Sporus now, permanently and publicly, Sabina was no longer allowed to vanish into the background. He was no longer a quiet figure beside Nero's throne, he was the throne's reflection. He traveled in a litter draped with sheer golden curtains pulled by white horses. At public games, he was seated beside the emperor, in a seat reserved for goddesses and first wives. At feasts, he accepted offerings of rare fruit and whispered praises as if they were his due. He played the role well. He always did. But behind the veil it was harder, because the illusion had become larger than the palace. It had spilled out into the streets, the provinces, the world. Ambassadors returned home, describing the Empress Sabina in glowing terms, graceful, refined, strangely youthful. Satirists hinted at the truth in scrolls passed in the dark, but most Romans couldn't or wouldn't believe it, because believing it meant confronting something uncomfortable, not just about Nero, but about themselves. This empire, after all, prided itself on order, hierarchy, tradition. Nero had always pushed the line, but marrying a teenage boy and parading him as a dead woman, that wasn't scandal. It was blasphemy against reality itself, and yet no one stopped him. Why? Because Rome was exhausted and afraid. Nero controlled the treasury, the military, the religious cults, and the city's food supply. Senators knew to clap. Generals knew to nod. Poets knew to write in flattering hexameter or not write at all. So the wedding stuck, and so did Sporus. At the Temple of Vesta, a new shrine was quietly constructed in Sabina's honor. It smelled of myrrh and oranges, and inside stood a statue, a perfect likeness of Poppeia's body, but with Sporus's newly molded face. Pilgrims lit candles at its feet, and Sporus, who still remembered the feel of the blade and the cold marble of his post-surgery room, was told to smile and say thank you. He did, because even gratitude was part of the script. Odd fact. Nero commissioned a team of actors to perform a dramatized version of his divine romance, in which a grieving emperor builds his wife from the sea foam of memory. It was performed in the amphitheater for 3 nights. Sporus was in the audience, in the front row, dressed in white. He applauded. He always did. But inside, it ached. Not just physically, though his body still protested, still flinched when touched without warning, but emotionally, psychologically, existentially, because every day he performed Sabina, a little more of Sporus slipped away. And then came Greece. Nero had long fantasized about his artistic pilgrimage to the cradle of civilization. He wasn't just an emperor after all. He was a poet, a singer, a god in need of a proper stage. So he packed up his court, his instruments, his makeup, his tunics embroidered with silver lyres, and sailed for the Aegean. And of course, Sabina came too. She didn't have a choice. She never did. The voyage was grand. Over a dozen ships loaded with food, wine, musicians, actors, and servants. At each port, Nero insisted on performing. Sometimes in local amphitheaters, sometimes in temples, always to standing ovations, though the audiences were more fearful than moved. Sabina sat beside him at every performance, clapped when he finished, smiled at every bow. Once in Delphi, a Greek noble leaned in to say, "She has the eyes of Aphrodite." And Sabina laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was the only safe response. Historians still debate whether the Greeks were genuinely charmed by Nero's performances or simply too stunned to respond. Either way, their empire had become a traveling circus, and Sabina was the show's crown jewel. In Corinth, Nero had coins minted. On one side his face, on the other Sabina's. The engraving was delicate, feminine, idealized. It didn't resemble Sporus at all. That was the point. And yet to the crowds waving palm fronds, Sabina was real, tangible, touchable. They reached out for the hem of her gown. Some offered prayers. One woman reportedly handed her a sprig of laurel and said, "May you bear 1,000 sons." Sporus nodded, and almost threw up in the litter afterward. The contradiction grew unbearable. The world bowed to an illusion. They kissed the feet of someone who didn't exist. They asked favors of a statue, and inside that statue was a boy who hadn't spoken his own name in over a year. One night in a coastal villa in Patras, he stood on the balcony overlooking the sea. The sky was bruised with stars. Below, Nero slept off a performance high, his body draped over silk pillows, mouth slightly open. Sporus stared at the waves and whispered his name. Not Sabina, Sporus. It came out like a secret, like a spell broken, like breath returned, and then he turned back to the room, put on the veil, and lay down beside the emperor, because morning was coming, and the play was never over. The play might never have ended, but even the most lavish productions run out of funding or patience. By the time Nero and Sabina returned from their grand tour of Greece, the empire had changed, and it wasn't smiling anymore. Rome was restless. The senators had grown tired of pretending. The generals, those who'd stayed behind, had begun sharpening their ambitions. Food was scarce in some provinces. The treasury had bled dry from festivals, races, temples, theatrical subsidies, and of course the costs of keeping an entire court entertained abroad. And while Nero had been singing hymns in Corinth, rebellion had begun to crackle through the provinces like a slow-burning fire. But he couldn't feel it yet. Not in the palace where the cushions were still soft and Sabina still smiled. He would wake late and call for her, his voice hoarse with wine and incense. "Sabina, my goddess, bring me my pearls." And Sporus would appear already dressed, already perfect. Because what else was there to do? They'd been back in Rome only a few weeks before the news arrived. Spain had revolted, then Gaul, then Africa. Not the peasants. Nero never feared the peasants. They could be distracted with bread and circus, but the governors, the commanders, they were rising. And they had the one thing Nero couldn't perform into submission armies. For the first time, Nero's confidence faltered. He stopped singing, stopped rehearsing. He began pacing. Sabina stayed close, but it wasn't the same. Nero still called him his wife, still held his hand at feasts, but now the gestures were tighter. Not performative, possessive. A man drowning in silk, dragging the nearest body down with him. He no longer treated Sporus like a resurrected goddess. He treated him like a mirror, one that could never be allowed to reflect anything except love. Sporus had learned to read these shifts, learned to sense the tremble before the storm. He became quieter, more pliable. The boy who had once dared to raise his eyes during processions now rarely lifted them from the floor. There were fewer guests in the palace now, fewer musicians, Even the laughter had changed. It was nervous, thin. Nero tried to buy loyalty the only way he knew how extravagantly. He handed out gold wine horses, citizenships. But loyalty bought with jewels fades when food disappears and war looms. One day the guards were still saluting. The next, they were gone. Rome's Praetorian Guard, his personal bodyguard, had turned. That was when Nero fled. In the middle of the night, with a handful of servants and a heart full of panic, he slipped out of the city wrapped in a cloak, trying to look like anything but a god. Sporus went with him. Of course he did, because the illusion had been total for too long. There was no escape from it now. Not without unraveling everything. They holed up in a villa outside the city Nero Sporus, a freedman named Phaon, and a few others who hadn't yet betrayed them. Outside the walls, the Senate had declared Nero a public enemy. A man who had once been worshipped in the East, who had played Orpheus and Apollo on stage, now had a price on his head. Even gods can fall. Inside the villa, time fractured. Nero alternated between pacing and despair. One minute he'd rant about how Rome would beg for his return. The next he'd crumple into a ball on the floor and sob, calling for his mother, his wife, wives plural, and for anyone to tell him what to do. And Sporus, faithful, silent, ever-adaptable Sporus, held him, wiped his face, sang softly as he had been taught. Once Nero gripped his wrist and whispered, "You'd stay with me, even if I had nothing, wouldn't you?" And Sporus, looking into the eyes of a man who had stolen his life and his body, whispered back, "Of course," because what else could he say? Historians still debate whether Sporus felt love in those final days. But maybe love isn't the right question. Maybe the better one is what happens when someone becomes your entire world, even if they built that world from your bones. Nero talked often of suicide now, but only talked. He couldn't do it. He begged his companions to kill him. They refused. Eventually, it was Phaon who handed him the dagger. And Sporus, still dressed in the remnants of bridal robes, now worn and stained, watched as Nero pressed the blade to his throat and flinched. Even then, he couldn't finish it. It was said that Phaon helped, that Nero wept even as he died, that the emperor's final words were, "What an artist dies in me." And then, silence. The illusion shattered, the curtains fell, and Sporus, he was left standing in the debris of a performance that had never really been his. No longer a wife, no longer an empress, no longer needed. What happened next wasn't freedom. It was just exposure, because the world outside the palace still remembered, still whispered, still stared. And Sporus, still adorned, still haunted, still breathing, was about to find out what it meant to be visible. Again, they didn't let him grieve. Not really. There was no time for mourning when you were still wearing a dead emperor's perfume, and your name had been legally changed to match a ghost. Sporus was still draped in imperial silks when Nero's body was hauled away, still carrying the weight of a marriage that had ended with a bloody dagger in someone else's hands. And suddenly he was nobody again. No title, no protection, no place, except that wasn't entirely true. Because in Rome, even discarded toys had value. Especially when they'd belonged to someone famous. Especially when they looked like they'd belonged to someone famous. The power vacuum that followed Nero's death was brutal. Rome wasn't designed for empty thrones. 4 emperors rose and fell in a single year, each one clawing his way to the top, bleeding influence from rival provinces, bribing legions, making and breaking oaths in a single breath. It was chaos, and chaos has a way of scooping up the most unlikely survivors. Sporus was one of them. He should have disappeared, should have vanished into the back rooms of history, just another victim of imperial madness. But instead, he was passed from man to man, not like a servant or a citizen, but like property. A relic. A strange, beautiful token of the last emperor's excess. A walking conversation piece. A political pawn. First Nymphidius Sabinus, an ambitious Praetorian Guard commander claimed him. Nymphidius fancied himself a successor to Nero, not by lineage, not even by public approval, but by proximity. And what better symbol of legitimacy than Nero's own widow? So Sporus was brought to his estate, still called Sabina, still veiled, still dressed as an empress. Nymphidius paraded him at banquets, asked him to pour wine, called him my lady. He even announced plans to marry him, echoing the wedding that had shocked Rome only 2 years earlier. The guests laughed, but no one said no, because power still hovered around Sporus, like the scent of frankincense, faint but undeniable. And Sporus, he played along. He always had, not because he believed it, but because it kept him alive. Still, the mask grew heavier each day. Nymphidius didn't last long. He was killed before the wedding could take place, stabbed by his own soldiers, when they realized he wasn't going to deliver on his promises. One day, Sporus was being fitted for a new wedding robe. The next, he was bundled into a carriage, his fate undecided. Then came Otho, another short-lived emperor, another man who thought holding Sporus meant holding on to legitimacy. Otho had once been married to Poppaea Sabina before Nero had taken her, before all the silk and the lies. Seeing Sporus now dressed in her image must have been surreal and cruel. He didn't marry him, but he kept him close, displayed him, talked to him in low, nostalgic tones as if memory could be touched. And Sporus listened, nodded, responded when addressed, because that's what they all expected, because no one ever asked him what he wanted. And then Otho died too. Suicide. Another bloody mirror. Another echo. Sporus, still draped in widow's black, moved on. Next came Vitellius. And Vitellius was different. He didn't pretend to love Sporus, didn't call him Sabina, didn't whisper sweet things in the dark. No, Vitellius saw Sporus for what he truly was, not a lover, not a wife, but a symbol. A grotesque curiosity. Proof of how far Rome had fallen under Nero's reign. And he wanted to make a point, so he devised a performance, a public one, in the Colosseum. Sporus was to be paraded in the arena during the Saturnalia Games, a mock mythological reenactment. The script, Sabina would be attacked and violated by a savage beast representing the rage of a vengeful god. It wasn't even subtle. It wasn't supposed to be. It was spectacle, bloody, humiliating, and designed to erase whatever shred of dignity Sporus had left, to turn him from a mystery back into an object, a warning, a joke. And the worst part, the audience would cheer. Historians still debate whether this was a sanctioned execution or just sadism dressed as theater. But for Sporus, it was the final curtain, the end of every illusion. He had spent years being reshaped, renamed, dressed, displayed, and controlled. He had survived surgeries, ceremonies, and the suffocating expectations of a man who couldn't bear the consequences of his own grief. He had endured being called a goddess, being called a wife, being called a ghost. But he would not be called a joke. He refused, so he made a choice, the first truly his. He found poison. Some say it was hidden in a ring. Others suggest it was slipped into wine. There are even accounts claiming a sympathetic servant helped him, someone who had once powdered his cheeks, and finally saw the human beneath the performance. Either way, he took it quietly. No spectacle, no audience, just a soft, decisive exit. He was probably no older than 20, and yet his life had contained lifetimes. Childhood, slavery, freedom, imperial bride, political token, public shame, and finally silence. Sporus died not as Sabina, not as Nero's ghost, not as anyone's property or pawn. He died as himself, or at least whatever was left of himself. Whatever fragile ember had survived the years of erasure. His death didn't shake Rome. It wasn't newsworthy. No coins were minted, no statues carved, but it meant something. To him, to history, to anyone who's ever been rewritten by someone else's script. Because in the end, Sporus chose not to be paraded, not to be laughed at, not to be remembered only as an accessory to someone else's madness. He chose the one act of defiance still available, and in doing so, reclaimed the thing denied to him from the moment Nero first saw his face. Agency. It's strange, isn't it? That a boy who was transformed against his will, who was dressed up as a lie for the pleasure of emperors, who was mourned only in whispers, could still leave behind a legacy of such tragic power. But he did. He left behind a story too sharp to be smoothed by time, one that refuses to be forgotten, even if most people don't know his name, even if all they remember is the wedding, even if all they see is the silk. He was more than the mask. He was more than the dress. He was more than the myth he was forced to wear. And maybe, just maybe, that's why we're still talking about him now. The room was quiet when Sporus died. Not the stillness of reverence or honor, but that eerie kind of silence that comes after the laughter has stopped and everyone's gone home. No trumpets, no mourning procession, no marble inscription to immortalize the moment. Just a quiet breath, and then none. Some say he took the poison while sitting alone in his chambers. Others believe he was already dressed for the arena, makeup applied, veil pinned, body trembling beneath yards of silk when he made his final decision. However it happened, the effect was the same when they came to fetch him for the performance. There was nothing left to take. No tears, no rage, no apology. Just a body, small, pale, still, wrapped in the costume of someone who had never existed. We'll never know what Sporus thought in those final moments. Whether he saw himself as brave or broken, as martyr or mistake. Whether he thought of the boy he had once been, or of the man he'd been made to imitate. But we do know this: he chose his ending. And for someone who had been denied so many choices, his name, his voice, his future, that final act matters. More than any statue, more than any scroll, more than any wedding. The irony, of course, is that Sporus' story didn't die with him. It lingered, mutated, became something else in the hands of later historians. Ancient writers rarely wrote about Sporus with compassion. To them, he was little more than a symptom, a warning sign, a living footnote to Nero's excess. They wrote about him the way you write about a strange animal at court. Fascinating, disturbing, worth a sentence or two. But not human. They didn't ask who he was before the palace, what he wanted, what he feared. They called him effeminate, a mimic, a grotesque reflection. But we can read between the lines now. We can see what they didn't or refused to. A boy taken into a machine of power, transformed into a fantasy, taught to erase himself in real time, who somehow survived for years under the weight of other people's delusions, who kept going, kept performing, kept smiling, even as the mask fused to his skin. Odd fact: Roman funerals for elite women included hired mourners, women paid to scream, weep, and tear their clothes in public. They were called praefecti. They made sorrow theatrical palatable. Sporus had none of them. He had no mourning rituals, no carved epitaph, no grieving husband tearing his tunic in the streets. The empire was too busy moving on. One emperor died, another stepped in. The marble walls were scrubbed, the linens changed, the stage reset. But the imprint of Sporus didn't fade. Not really. You see it in how we talk about power now, how we whisper about masks and performance, how we ask quietly, cautiously what it means to lose yourself in someone else's dream. His story has become more than a historical curiosity. It's a mirror, not of Nero's tyranny, though, of course it is that too, but of the human cost of control, the price of being forced into a role you never chose, of living as a memory instead of a person. Historians still debate whether Nero genuinely believed Sporus was Poppaea reborn, or whether he simply needed the illusion so desperately that he forced the entire world to participate. But Sporus knew the truth, because he was the one bleeding behind the curtain, the one smiling through the silence, the one remembering things that never happened and pretending they were his. He was the ghost of a woman who had died in violence, and yet even as a ghost, he wasn't allowed to rest. So he found a way to rest on his own, by his own hand, on his own terms. In a world that had used him for beauty, for scandal, for theater, that was the greatest resistance of all. And now, as the oil lamps flicker low and the marble floors cool with midnight, we remember him not as an empress, not as a mistake, not as an ornament, but as a person. A boy who once had a name, a body, a dream, and who, against impossible odds, found a moment, just one, where he got to say no more. And in that breath reclaimed the one thing no emperor could take: his self, his end, his peace. So now we lay this story down gently, like the silk robes that once adorned a boy who was never allowed to be himself. Let the lights dim, let the voices fade, let the memory of Sporus drift, not in agony, not in spectacle, but in silence. He was never meant to be remembered. Not really. But here you are with his name on your tongue, his story pressed against your thoughts as you lie in the dark. That means something. It means he isn't just a footnote. He isn't just a whisper behind the marble. He's still here, still echoing, still reminding us what happens when love turns to possession, when grief becomes control, when beauty is carved from pain. So sleep now with that thought close to your chest. A single candle in the long hallway of history. A reminder that even the softest voice, even the quietest figure in the background, deserves to be seen not as a symbol, but as a soul. Good night.